In the autumn of 1934, the most famous courtroom in America contained a 10-year-old girl. She was not on trial. No crime had been committed. What was being decided? In 7 weeks of proceedings, so sensational that the judge repeatedly cleared the gallery, so scandalous that testimony was given in whispers, so grotesque in its particulars that newspapers across the country ran it on their front pages for a month and a half, was something that should have been simple. Who would raise her? On one side of the courtroom, her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, 29 years old, beautiful, the widow of one of the great Vanderbilt fortunes, a woman who had spent the years since her husband's death moving between Paris and New York with her daughter in tow, living on the income from a trust fund that the courts were beginning to look at very carefully. On the other side, her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, sculptor, philanthropist, founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the woman who had, by the time the trial began, already been raising her niece for months and who wanted, permanently and legally, to continue. In the middle, a child with a name that the newspapers had decided was the most important name in America. A fortune, held in trust, that both women had reasons to want administered according to their preferences. A childhood that was being conducted, in its entirety, in public, argued over by lawyers, examined by judges, reported by journalists, and consumed by a public that had made the spectacle of wealthy people's private disasters into the primary entertainment of the Depression era. The newspapers called her the poor little rich girl. They had also called Barbara Hutton that. The phrase was becoming, in the 1930s, a kind of journalistic shorthand for a specific American phenomenon, the heiress whose fortune made her enviable and whose life made her pitiable, and whose existence confirmed, for a public living through economic catastrophe, some complicated mixture of schadenfreude and sympathy. But Gloria Vanderbilt was not Barbara Hutton. She was not a woman who had come into her money and struggled with it. She was a child who had not yet come into her money and was already, at 10 years old, being fought over by the adults whose interests were entangled with it. She would spend the next 85 years building a self out of the wreckage of that beginning. What she built was extraordinary. What it cost her was everything. This is the story of Gloria Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt name, by 1924, was one of the oldest and most significant in American wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the man who started it all, had built his fortune in the 19th century through steamships and railroads, accumulating by the time of his death in 1877 the largest private fortune in the country. He left approximately $100 million, the equivalent, in purchasing power, of something approaching $3 billion today, primarily to his son William Henry Vanderbilt, with the explicit instruction that it be kept together and passed down through the family. It was not kept together. By the time Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born in 1924, the Vanderbilt fortune had been distributed, spent, divided, and subdivided across 4 generations of heirs with varying degrees of financial discipline and wildly varying appetites for the lifestyle that the name implied. The great houses, Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue that had made the stretch of the street between 51st and 57th Streets into what society called Vanderbilt Row, were being sold, or had already been sold. The Newport cottages, those extraordinary summer estates that were called cottages with the specific irony of the very rich, who reserve the most diminutive words for the most extravagant things, were passing to other hands. The Vanderbilts were not poor. They were, by any ordinary measure, still wealthy. But the specific weight of the name, the assumption of inexhaustible fortune that the Commodore's achievement had created, and that the subsequent generations had been living against, was beginning to exceed the actual resources available to sustain it. Reginald Vanderbilt was 40 years old when his daughter was born. He was a railroad heir, the great-grandson of the Commodore, a man whose name opened every door in New York and whose actual fortune, by the time of Gloria's birth, had been substantially reduced by a lifetime of spending that the income from the remaining assets could not quite sustain. He had been married before to Kathleen Nielsen, with whom he had a daughter, Kathleen, who was Gloria's elder half-sister. He had divorced Kathleen Nielsen and married Gloria Morgan in 1923, a marriage that the social world of the era regarded with the particular mixture of approval and reservation that attended the union of an established American dynasty with a beautiful young woman of less certain background. Gloria Morgan was 20 years old at the time of the marriage. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her then, extraordinarily beautiful. Her twin sister Thelma equally so, the two of them moving through the social world of the early 1920s as a kind of double vision, identical and competitive and aware of what their beauty represented in a world that valued it highly and rewarded it inconsistently. Reginald Vanderbilt died on September 4, 1925. Gloria was 18 months old. He died of cirrhosis, the accumulated consequence of decades of drinking that the social world in which he moved had regarded as a gentleman's prerogative rather than a medical emergency. He left behind a fortune that was, by the standards of what the name implied, modest. A trust fund of approximately $5 million to be divided equally between his two daughters. Half to Kathleen, half to Gloria. The income from Gloria's share, approximately $115,000 a year, according to court records, was to be administered by her mother until Gloria came of age. What followed, the years between Reginald's death in 1925 and the custody trial in 1934, was the childhood that produced the woman. And it was not, by any measure that takes children seriously, a good childhood. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was 22 years old when her husband died, and she became the administrator of her daughter's income. She was beautiful and social and entirely unprepared for the specific responsibilities of raising a child alone while managing a fortune that was not, technically, hers, but that she was living on as though it were. She traveled, Paris primarily, the city that the wealthy Americans of the 1920s treated as a second home, where the cost of living was lower and the quality of life, by the standards of the international set, was higher. She took Gloria with her, and Gloria's nanny, Emma Sullivan Kieslick, whom the child had named Dodo, and her twin sister Thelma, whose lover was the Prince of Wales, which gave the sisters' Paris life a proximity to royalty that Gloria Morgan found deeply satisfying. The child moved between hotels and rented houses and the apartments of acquaintances, in the company of adults who were primarily interested in each other, attended by a nanny she loved more than she loved her mother, educated by the accident of what was available wherever they happened to be rather than by any consistent plan. She was enrolled in schools intermittently. She learned to be alone in rooms full of adults. She learned to read the emotional temperature of gatherings in which she was the youngest person present by many years. She learned, in the specific way of children who grow up as accessories to their parents' social lives rather than as the primary concern of a household organized around their needs, to make herself acceptable to whatever environment she found herself in. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Gloria's paternal aunt, her father's sister, was watching. Gertrude was everything that Gloria Morgan was not, in the specific way that the Vanderbilt family had produced, across its generations, two distinct types, the spenders and the builders. She was a sculptor of genuine accomplishment, a philanthropist of serious purpose, the founder of what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art. She was also enormously wealthy in her own right, her husband Harry Payne Whitney having left her a fortune that dwarfed what remained of Reginald's estate. She had concerns about her niece's upbringing, documented concerns, expressed in letters and conversations that would eventually become court records. Concerns about the child's stability, her education, the consistency of her care, the quality of attention she was receiving from a mother who was, by Gertrude's account, more interested in her own social life than in the welfare of her daughter. She was not wrong about the concerns. She was also not, and this is the complication at the heart of the custody trial that is about to consume 7 weeks of 1934, entirely right about the solution. Because the solution Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney proposed was to remove a child from her mother. Permanently. Legally. With the full authority of the New York courts. And the child, who loved her nanny and tolerated her mother and had opinions of her own that the adults around her had not thought to ask about, that child was going to be required to choose. In a courtroom, in public, at the age of 10. The something that was coming was the trial. And the trial, when it arrived, in the autumn of 1934, would be, by the standards of American legal history, one of the most extraordinary proceedings of the century. Not because of what was at stake legally, but because of what was at stake humanly. A 10-year-old girl, in a courtroom, being asked to choose between two versions of her life, while the newspapers of America turned that choice into entertainment, and the adults around her turned it into strategy, and nobody, in the 7 weeks of proceedings that followed, asked the question that mattered most. What did Gloria actually want? The custody trial of 1934 was called, by the newspapers that covered it with the appetite of people who have found exactly what they were looking for, the trial of the century. This was an exaggeration. It was also, given what the trial contained, not entirely wrong. The legal question was straightforward: who should have custody of Gloria Vanderbilt, minor, and administrative control of her trust fund until she reached majority? Her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, or her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney? The evidence presented in support of the answer was not straightforward at all. Gertrude's legal team built their case on the argument that Gloria Morgan was an unfit mother, that her daughter had been neglected, that the child's welfare had been subordinated to her mother's social life, that the income from the trust fund had been used to sustain a lifestyle in Paris and London that bore very little relationship to responsible parenthood. The evidence they presented included testimony from Marie Calotte, the family's former French maid, who alleged that Gloria Morgan had conducted an affair with the Marchioness of Milford Haven, a relative of the British royal family. Lady Milford Haven subsequently denied this in her own testimony. Barbara Goldsmith, Little Gloria, Happy at Last, 1981. The allegation was introduced into the trial record. The newspapers reported it. The public consumed it. The trial produced, over 7 weeks, a portrait of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt that was devastating in its particulars and contested in its conclusions. She was described as neglectful, as irresponsible with money, as more interested in the company of her social circle, which included, through her twin sister Thelma, proximity to the Prince of Wales and the world that surrounded him, than in the daily care of her daughter. Her defenders argued that she had provided for her daughter, that the child had a beloved nanny, that the Paris years had not been the neglect Gertrude's lawyers described, but simply the life of a young widow trying to manage grief and parenthood simultaneously in a world that offered her very little institutional support for either. The child was 10 years old. At some point during the proceedings, the exact circumstances are described differently by different accounts, but the fact itself is documented. The judge cleared the courtroom and spoke with Gloria privately. What she said in that room was not entered into the public record in full. What emerged from behind the closed door was the sound of weeping. Whose weeping was disputed. What is documented is the outcome. The judge ruled in Gertrude's favor. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt lost custody of her daughter. She was permitted visits, carefully supervised, with restrictions designed to prevent what the court described as undue influence. She was granted a reduced portion of the trust income. She was, in the legal language of the decision, found to have been an inadequate parent. Gloria went to live with Gertrude in Old Westbury, Long Island. She attended the Greenville School, then Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, the same finishing school that Brooke Astor had attended a decade earlier, the institution that the daughters of the American establishment were sent to when the family wanted the form of education without the inconvenience of the content. Then the Wheeler School in Providence, Rhode Island. Then the Art Students League in New York City, where she began to develop the artistic talent that would define the second half of her life. She also, in these years, began to understand what the trial had done to her. Not immediately. The understanding of what it means to have your childhood conducted as a public spectacle, to have your mother's private life aired in a courtroom, while the newspapers of a country in economic depression consumed it as entertainment, to have been the subject of a decision that determined your entire world without anyone asking you what you actually wanted. This understanding does not arrive all at once. It arrives across a lifetime of returning to it, of finding it unexpectedly in the middle of ordinary days. She was 15 when she began modeling. She was 17 when she married for the first time. Pat Disico was an agent for actors with alleged connections to organized crime, a detail that the social world she moved in regarded with the specific tolerance that wealth and glamour extend to danger, when danger presents itself attractively. He was older than her. He was, by her own account given decades later, violent. "He would take my head and bang it against the wall," she said. "I had black eyes." Gloria Vanderbilt quoted in multiple interviews. He called her Fatsy Roo. She was 17 years old and one of the most famous names in America, and her husband called her Fatsy Roo and beat her. She divorced him in 1945. She was 21. Within weeks of the divorce, she married Leopold Stokowski. Leopold Stokowski was 42 years older than Gloria Vanderbilt. He was one of the most celebrated conductors in the world, the man who had conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra for 26 years, who had collaborated with Disney on Fantasia, whose face and name were as recognizable in the world of classical music as any in the century. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man of considerable personal authority and very clear ideas about how the people around him should conduct themselves. They had two sons, Leopold Stanislaus, born in 1950, and Christopher, born in 1952. The marriage ended in divorce in 1955. The third marriage was to the film director Sidney Lumet, 8 years her senior. A marriage that lasted from 1956 to 1963, that produced no children, that ended as the previous marriages had ended. With a divorce, with Gloria beginning again, the fourth marriage was different. Wyatt Emery Cooper was a writer from Mississippi. He was 5 years younger than Gloria. He had none of the dynastic weight of the Vanderbilt name, none of the social grandeur of a Stokowski, none of the Hollywood gloss of a Lumet. He was a man who loved his wife and showed it in the ordinary daily ways that love, when it is genuine, tends to show itself. They married on December 24, 1963. They had two sons, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, born January 27, 1965. Anderson Hayes Cooper, born June 3, 1967. The marriage lasted 15 years, ended not by choice, but by Wyatt Cooper's death during open-heart surgery in January 1978. In those 15 years, the years of the Wyatt Cooper marriage, the years of genuine stability, Gloria Vanderbilt built something. She had always made art. The Art Students League training, the exhibitions that began in 1948, the paintings and collages and watercolors that she produced with the consistency of someone for whom art is not a hobby but a necessity. In the 1970s, she took the name that had defined and confined her since birth and converted it into something she controlled: designer jeans. In 1976, designer Mohan Mirjani proposed putting Gloria Vanderbilt's signature on the back pocket of a line of fitted jeans. She agreed. The jeans launched. They sold in quantities that transformed the fashion industry's understanding of what a celebrity name could do on a product. She built from there dresses, blouses, sheets, shoes, leather goods, fragrances. By the late 1970s, the Gloria Vanderbilt brand was generating revenues that made her, for the first time in her life, genuinely financially independent. Not dependent on the trust fund, not dependent on a husband, not dependent on anyone. She was 50 years old. She had survived a custody trial that had made her childhood into a public spectacle. She had survived a violent first marriage. She had survived 3 divorces. She had raised 4 sons. She had lost a husband she loved. And she had taken the name that the world had decided was the most important thing about her, the name she had not chosen and could not escape, and turned it into something she owned. The rise of Gloria Vanderbilt was not the rise of the heiress the newspapers had made her. It was the rise of a woman who had been defined by circumstances she did not choose, and who, at 50, had finally found the vocabulary, in art, in design, in the conversion of her name into her own instrument, to define herself. What she did not yet know, in the late 1970s, was that the ground beneath this hard-won stability was already beginning to shift. The people who had helped her build it were not all what they appeared to be, and the loss that was coming, the loss that would arrive not in a courtroom, but in an apartment, on a July afternoon in 1988, would be the one she did not survive whole. She did not survive whole. The fashion empire that Gloria Vanderbilt had built through the late 1970s began to encounter difficulties in the 1980s. The difficulties were partly structural. The designer jeans market, which had exploded in the late 1970s, began to contract as it saturated, and the brands that had built themselves on the first wave of that explosion found themselves competing in a market that was no longer the one they had entered. Partly they were legal. In the 1980s, Gloria Vanderbilt accused her former partners in GV Limited and her lawyer of fraud. The accusation was serious. The trial that followed was lengthy. The lawyer died during the proceedings. At the conclusion, Gloria won, awarded nearly $1.7 million in damages, plus $300,000 from the New York City Bar Association. Various news sources, including the New York Times. The money was never recovered. What was recovered, or rather, what was discovered during the legal proceedings, was that the lawyer had never paid Gloria's taxes to the IRS. The back taxes owed were substantial. To satisfy them, she was forced to sell her home in Southampton and her apartment on the Upper East Side. The woman who had built a brand on her name, who had finally achieved genuine financial independence after 5 decades of living on a trust fund and husband's incomes, was forced to liquidate the properties she had worked to acquire. She rebuilt, she moved, she continued. This is one of the most consistent facts about Gloria Vanderbilt across 9 decades. She continued. Whatever was taken, the childhood, the marriages, the properties, the money, she found a way to continue, to make something new from what remained. But the 1980s were also the decade in which the ground shifted in ways that no amount of resilience could fully address. Her son Carter was struggling. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was born in 1965, the eldest of Gloria's 2 sons with Wyatt Cooper. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a young man of genuine sensitivity and considerable difficulty. Bright, funny, possessed of the Cooper warmth that his father had brought into the family, and that his death in 1978, when Carter was 13, had interrupted. He was 23 years old in July of 1988. On July 22, 1988, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper jumped from the terrace of his mother's 14th-floor apartment. He was 23 years old. Gloria Vanderbilt was present. She has written about what she witnessed. She has spoken about it. She wrote a memoir, A Mother's Story, published in 1996, specifically about Carter, specifically about that afternoon, specifically about the years of attempting to understand what had happened, and why and whether anything she had done or not done had been part of it. The memoir is, by every account that has engaged with it, one of the most honest documents a parent has ever produced about the death of a child. The death of Carter Cooper did not break Gloria Vanderbilt in the way that public narrative tends to describe things breaking people, dramatically, completely, with a clear before and after. What it did was something more permanent and more internal. It changed the center of gravity of her life. Everything afterward was organized, in some way she may not have been able to fully articulate, around what had happened on that July afternoon. She continued to make art. She continued to write. She continued to be, in the social world of New York, a presence, recognizable, engaged, the woman in the extraordinary apartment who had survived more than most people are asked to survive, and who had, against the evidence, maintained the capacity for joy. But the crack was there. Not in her character, which was, if anything, deepened by what she had endured. In the architecture of a life that had absorbed too many losses in too many forms, the mother, the father, the custody trial, the violent husband, the divorces, the business betrayal, the properties lost to taxes someone else had failed to pay, and now this. The irreversible this. The one relationship that would prove, in the years that followed, to be the genuinely sustaining one, the one that offered something close to the unconditional warmth that her childhood had denied her, was not a marriage and not a friendship in the conventional sense. It was with her younger son. Anderson Cooper was 21 years old when his brother died. He was, by the time his mother's final decade arrived, the most recognized television journalist in America, a CNN anchor whose face appeared on screens across the world during every major event of the early 21st century. He was also, quietly and consistently, his mother's son. The relationship between Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper in her final years was documented, in a book they wrote together, in a documentary they made together, in the conversations they had on camera with a frankness that public figures rarely manage, and that both of them seemed to find, in the doing of it, genuinely necessary. The book was called The Rainbow Comes and Goes, published in 2017. The documentary was called Nothing Left Unsaid, released on HBO in 2016. Both were attempts to say, before the time ran out, the things that had not been said. To account for the life in full, the custody trial, the marriages, the business, the art, Carter's death, the decades of survival. To leave nothing, as the title put it, unsaid. It was, in its way, the most courageous thing Gloria Vanderbilt ever did. Not the fashion empire, not the art exhibitions, not the custody trial survived at 10 years old, or the violent marriage survived at 17, or the business fraud survived at 60. The decision, at 92 years old, to sit down with her son and tell him everything. Because the thing that had haunted her life since 1934, since the courtroom and the closed door and the weeping that the witnesses heard but could not source, was not the money and not the name and not the public scrutiny that had followed her everywhere she went. It was the silence, the things left unsaid between the people who should have said them, and she was determined, in whatever time remained, not to leave that silence unbroken. In the spring of 2019, Gloria Vanderbilt was diagnosed with stomach cancer. She was 95 years old. The diagnosis was delivered, by her own account and Anderson Cooper's, with the directness she had always preferred, no softening, no management of the information to protect her from it. She was told what was happening in her body. She was given the prognosis. She made her decisions accordingly. Anderson Cooper has spoken publicly about the weeks that followed his mother's diagnosis and the conversations they had during that time, conversations that continued, in the spirit of the rainbow comes and goes and nothing left unsaid, the project of saying what needed to be said while there was still time to say it. He has described his mother in those final weeks as clear-eyed, as herself, as the person she had always been, curious, engaged, still making art in her mind even when her body would no longer cooperate with the physical demands of making it. She died on June 17, 2019, at her home in Manhattan. She was 95 years old. She died in the apartment that contained her art and her books and her accumulated life. Not in a hospital, not in a facility. At home, in the environment she had made, in the company of the person she loved most. Anderson Cooper was with her. He spoke about her death on CNN that evening, in the specific way that journalism and grief intersect when the journalist is also the grieving child. Carefully, precisely, with the control of someone who has learned his profession and the emotion of someone who has just lost his mother. He described her as a fierce woman who had lived on her own terms. He said that she was one of the most creative people he had ever known. He said that he was extraordinarily lucky to have had her as my mother. She was interred in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island, alongside Carter and Wyatt Cooper. The three of them together, the husband she had loved, and the son she had lost and now herself, in the stone architecture of a dynasty that her grandfather's grandfather had built, and that she had spent 95 years both inhabiting and escaping. The financial accounting of her estate produced the detail that, in the days following her death, generated the most commentary. Gloria Vanderbilt had been rumored, throughout her life, to be worth approximately $200 million. The figure was a reasonable estimate based on the value of the Gloria Vanderbilt brand at its peak. The trust fund, the properties, the accumulated assets of a life lived at a certain level for 9 decades. The actual value of the estate she left to Anderson Cooper was approximately $1.5 million. $1.5 million. From a fortune that had, at various points in its history, been estimated at 200 times that amount. The distance between those two figures is the financial biography of Gloria Vanderbilt. The trust fund administered by a mother whose spending the courts found troubling, the legal fees of the custody trial, the 4 marriages and their endings, the business fraud and the unpaid taxes, and the properties sold to satisfy the IRS. The decades of supporting a lifestyle that the name implied even as the assets underlying it contracted. Anderson Cooper, speaking publicly about the inheritance, was characteristically direct. He had not expected money. He had not been raised to expect money. His mother had, he said, made clear throughout his life that he would need to make his own way, that the name was not a guarantee, and the fortune, to the extent it existed, was not something to count on. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the equanimity of a man who had understood, watching his mother's life, exactly what inherited wealth and inherited names could and could not provide. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died in 1942, 8 years after winning the custody trial. The Whitney Museum of American Art, her most significant legacy, the institution she founded in 1930 to exhibit American art at a time when the major museums were primarily interested in European work. continues. It is, by any measure, a serious and consequential institution. It bears her name. It does the work she intended. She was, in her own right and apart from the custody trial entirely, a remarkable person. The complexity of her role in Gloria's story, the aunt who genuinely believed she was acting in her niece's best interests, the woman who took a child from her mother and raised her in luxury and also in a kind of structured coldness, is not resolved by the institutional legacy. It simply sits alongside it. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother who lost the trial, died in Los Angeles in 1965. She and her daughter eventually reconciled, though the reconciliation was, by Gloria's own account, partial, the wound of the trial and its aftermath too deep for full repair. The years of supervised visitation and the public humiliation of the verdict too significant to be entirely transcended. Gloria cut her mother off financially when she came of age and took control of the trust. They later found their way back to something. Not everything, but something. The Gloria Vanderbilt fashion brand passed through various corporate transactions, from Murjani to Gitano Group to Jones Apparel Group, which acquired the jeans rights in 2002. Nine West Holdings, the brand's eventual parent company, filed for bankruptcy in 2018. The name continued. The woman who had made it valuable was 94 years old and living on $1.5 million. Anderson Cooper, the younger son, the CNN anchor, the man who sat with his mother through her final weeks and who had spent years in conversation with her about everything that had not been said, continued his career. He wrote about his mother. He spoke about her. He grieved publicly and professionally, and with the specific discipline of someone who has learned that grief, like everything else, requires work. He donated his inheritance from his mother to charity. A decision consistent with what she had told him throughout his life about money and its relationship to identity. The documentary Nothing Left Unsaid remains, in the body of work that Gloria Vanderbilt left behind, the most complete account of who she actually was. Not the trial, not the jeans, not the marriages, the conversations with her son, in her apartment, among her paintings. The book The Rainbow comes and goes mother and son in correspondence, exchanging the things that needed to be said, remains in print. The paintings continue to be exhibited. The art continues. The self she built from the ruins of a childhood conducted in a courtroom, imperfect, complicated, genuine, continues in the work she left behind. Which brings us, finally, to the question that the story of Gloria Vanderbilt insists on asking. Not what happened to the money. Not whether the judge was right in 1934. Not which marriage failed for which reason or which business partner betrayed which trust. But what it actually means, for any of us, not just for her, to build a self when the world has decided, from the beginning, that it already knows what you are. Here is what the story of Gloria Vanderbilt is not. It is not a story about wealth corrupting. It is not a story about the emptiness of privilege or the inevitable consequence of being born to more than you need. It is not a morality tale about the rich and their problems, constructed for the comfort of people who are not rich and who find, in the spectacle of wealthy suffering, some confirmation that the distribution of fortune is not as unjust as it appears. These are the stories that get told about people like Gloria Vanderbilt. The poor little rich girl narrative is the oldest of them. The story that says the money and the misery are connected, that the fortune is somehow the cause of the suffering, that if you look at the life of an heiress and feel something like pity, the correct response is to remind yourself that she had every advantage. Gloria Vanderbilt did not suffer because she was rich. She suffered because she was a child. And the world, the legal world, the journalistic world, the social world, the world of ambitious adults whose interests were entangled with her trust fund, treated her not as a child, but as a contested object. What the custody trial of 1934 did to Gloria Vanderbilt was something that the legal system has never developed adequate language for. Because the legal system is designed to resolve disputes between adults and is poorly equipped to account for what it costs a child to be the subject of one. It made her public before she was a person. It established, before she had developed the self that would eventually emerge from the decades of work and loss and survival, that she was a subject, that her life was something that other people had opinions about and interests in, that the name she carried was more important to the world than the child who carried it. Every difficulty that followed in Gloria Vanderbilt's life, The violent first husband, the marriages that did not hold, the business partners who defrauded her, the lawyers who failed to pay her taxes, was easier because she came to them already trained in the specific discipline of a person who has learned, very early, that the world regards you primarily as a resource. Easier to exploit someone who has been taught from childhood that being exploited is the condition of their existence. Easier to take from someone who has never been shown, by the people who were supposed to show her, that what she had was hers. She became an artist. This is the fact about Gloria Vanderbilt that the custody trial and the genes and the marriages and the famous son tend to obscure, and that her story cannot be properly understood without. She became an artist. Not a hobbyist, not a dilettante, not a rich woman dabbling in creative work to fill the hours. A serious, consistent, lifelong artist who produced work of genuine quality across 9 decades. Who had her first exhibition in 1948 and her last in her 90s. Who adapted her visual language for collage and oils and watercolors and licensing and design with the fluency of someone for whom making things is not a career choice, but a biological necessity. The art was the answer. Not to the custody trial. There is no answer to the custody trial, no retroactive justice that makes a 10-year-old's public humiliation retroactively acceptable, but to the larger question that the trial had planted in her. The question of who she was, independently of the name and the trust fund and the newspapers and the adults whose interests competed for control of her. She answered it in paint. She answered it in collage. She answered it in the rooms full of her own work, in the apartment where she lived for decades surrounded by evidence of a self that she had made, slowly and consistently, and without anyone's permission, from the raw material of a life that had given her more than enough to work with. Anderson Cooper said, in the days following his mother's death, that she had told him something about inheritance that he has quoted more than once. She did not want him to rely on her money. She wanted him to make his own life with his own work on his own terms. This from a woman whose life had been, from its very first day, defined by her relationship to inherited wealth, who had been placed in a courtroom at 10 years old because 2 powerful adults wanted control of her trust fund, who had spent 50 years building something with her own name and her own hands and then watched it pass through corporate transactions and end in bankruptcy. She had understood from the inside exactly what inherited wealth could and could not do. And what she wanted for her son was the thing she had spent 95 years building for herself. Not the money, the self. The newspapers called her the poor little rich girl. They called Barbara Hutton that too. They deployed the phrase whenever a wealthy woman's life became publicly complicated, as though the complication were a product of the wealth rather than a product of the world's treatment of the person inside it. Gloria Vanderbilt was not poor in any material sense. She was not little. She was, in fact, one of the most substantial people of her century. And she was not, in the end, a girl. She was a woman who had been handed, at birth, a name she did not choose and a fortune she did not earn and a life that the world had decided it had opinions about, and who had spent 95 years quietly, persistently, at great personal cost, insisting on something else. The right to be, underneath all of it, a person, not a subject, not a ward, not an heiress, not a brand. A person with her own eyes and her own hands making things. The custody trial put a 10-year-old girl in a courtroom and asked the world to decide who owned her. Gloria Vanderbilt spent the next 85 years answering that question herself. Nobody owned her. Nobody ever had. It just took her a lifetime to make sure the world knew it. And the proof is in the paintings. Paintings.